Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I decided that today was a day we really should concentrate on blessings. Because Mother's Day, like every day, is really filled with blessings. However, sometimes it doesn't feel like it. Sometimes you go through days and maybe months and even years where it seems like, what happened to those blessings? Well, the interesting thing is that there is an infinite number of blessings awaiting you, always, but you have to invite them into your life. And today, I'm going to talk about how to stop blocking those blessings and instead welcome them into your life. So let's think about this. Do you ever think, or have you ever thought, that you can't have a particular blessing because your past has shown it doesn't happen to you? Maybe your family has always had limited funds, and you have had too. So how could you ever possibly become rich? Or maybe you've been sickly most of your life. So it does appear that health is not a possibility, that you could not have that blessing of health. Or maybe you've never been lucky in relationships, and so now how can you expect to have a good one? Well, Dr. Ernest Holmes reminds us in Living the Science of Mind that principle is not bound by precedent. He says the laws of nature, or the principles that govern life, know nothing about precedents. All spiritual power is at our disposal, no matter how limited a viewpoint we may have had yesterday, with the limitations that followed that viewpoint. Today, we can increase our field of awareness and make possible new good in our lives. But he adds, we can never do this unless we believe that we can. For the belief that we cannot binds us back to the old precedents and compels us to accept only as much good as we've experienced in the past. Well, we know in Science of Mind, as Dr. Ernest Holmes says, that belief is the trigger that tells universal law, God law, what to create in our lives. So there's lots of examples of people who have said, I'm going to stop living in limitation, and made great changes. I was reading an old book by Dr. Joseph Murphy called The Cosmic Energizer. And in it, he teaches the principles of science of mind. Well, there was a woman who had arthritis very severely. And she was very much afraid that she would end up being crippled like both her mother and her grandmother had been by this disease. But then she found Dr. Murphy's book and she started reading it. And she said, I'm going to change my attitude. And she began regularly to affirm that the divine healing presence was within her and was active and was flowing through her as harmony, vitality, and wholeness, as health and energy. And she pictured herself believing that she was already in this new healthy state. Her son also prayed for her in this same way. And then a so-called miracle happened. All the calcareous deposits were dissolved. She was completely healed of the disease and walked freely from that day forward. He tells about another case where a child had asthma very severely, and the mother learned about prayer treatment. She treated for her son. she saw him healthy, whole, and complete. And that asthma went away and never returned. The blessings are here, awaiting our acceptance. I think of Thomas Edison and the electric lights. That blessing of, turning on that light switch. I love that when I walk into a dark room. That blessing was always there. But it took somebody believing in that idea to actualize it and have it available in our lives now. And it's great that science has caught up with these great ideas that the mystics and Ernest Holmes have thought of over the years, of the truth of knowing that circumstance, it has no power in itself, that it is the consciousness that creates the lives we live. Greg Braden in The Divine Matrix talks about how quantum physics verifies the idea of infinite possibilities. He calls them, or they call them, science quantum potentials. Well, I'm not a scientist, so I kind of have to read somebody who's not a scientist talking about the scientists so that, it's about going down to my level. But I think it's pretty fascinating. And what he said in his book, and I've talked about this before, but I think it's so important to remember it, that there is that theory of waves and particles that has been accepted in the scientific community. And quantum physics describes, though, instead of the actual existence of particles, the potential existence, where they may be, how they might behave, and what their properties could be like. In other words, there are quantum potentials. Or we could say infinite blessings. And in this book, Greg Braden described one of the very interesting experiments that the quantum physicists did, called the double slit. The double slit. And it involved projecting quantum particles through a barrier and measuring the way the particles were detected before they went through the barrier and when they got out on the other side. So you would think, well, of course, there should be no big change here, because a particle starting as a particle, going through a barrier, coming on the other side would still be a particle. However, what they found was that if an electron started as a particle and passed through a barrier with just one hole in it, when it came out on the other side, it was still a particle. But if there were two holes in the barrier, the electron somehow changed its form into a wave and went through both holes at the same time, and it was a wave. And they said, electrons don't know things like we know things, so how could this happen? And they concluded that it was the consciousness of the observer, knowing that there were two slits to the barrier instead of just one, two openings, that conveyed the information to the electron. And that indeed, they concluded, consciousness plays a key role in the universe. He also tells of an experiment about DNA.